This meeting is going to be really focused on risk mitigation and the procurement process. Just starting with going through the agenda. So we'll start with a quick check-in question. We're not going to break you into small groups. We'll just do it via chat today. Then we'll talk through the procurement method and how the procurement method that you select will impact your procurement process. I know we got some feedback from a few people that would be helpful. Then we're going to talk about how your procurement process will vary depending on kind of your partner structure. And then there will be some time for Q&A on presentations. And then we'll actually switch it up a little bit and actually break you out into your small group for about 20 to 25 minutes after that presentation, just to break up the amount of time we're presenting at you. And then we'll go back to presenting on risk mitigation strategies, and we'll wrap up for the day. So for today, I wanted to start with just kind of orienting you with where we're at in the process. So as you remember, there's kind of this 5-step process of forming a procurement group, aligning on desired project details, selecting suppliers and projects, negotiating contracts, and then finally sharing lessons learned. We're still kind of at this aligning on desired project details stage. So figuring out whether you're interested in physical or virtual PPA and how that'll impact your procurement goals and your procurement process. And then also kind of identifying any other stakeholders that your group needs to work with. So you kind of know who your initial procurement partners are, but like, do you need to engage your utility? That will matter depending on the procurement process that you select. And then additionally, thinking through risk mitigation. And so like thinking about who actually is going to be managing the RFP and selecting the suppliers. What does the authorization look like, and when in the process do you need to get authorization? And then finally, understanding some risk mitigation strategies that you can pursue to make you feel more comfortable with your chosen procurement mechanism. So I'm going to pass it over to Mia to talk a little bit about kind of the various different ways that you can actually pursue an aggregated PPA and how kind of the path that you choose might influence kind of stakeholder engagement and the procurement process.
Thanks, Elisa. So in particular, I'm going to be talking about how physical and virtual PPAs have slightly different procurement processes. So first, to recap, for physical PPAs, you're procuring the physical renewable energy as well as the renewable energy credits associated with the project. Groups going with this approach will need to align on the preferred method for actually receiving that physical power as part of their procurement process. And this is primarily going to be work engaging externally, for example, with a utility or a retail supplier. Groups that are pursuing virtual PPAs are going to be procuring the renewable energy credits associated with the facility. They'll be aligning on the contract mechanism to use for the VPPA, and then primarily will be engaging internally with legal, accounting, and procurement staff, and if necessary, pursuing authorizing legislation as we discussed at the previous cohort meeting. I'm going to primarily now talk about 3 different methods for energy delivery when pursuing a physical power purchase agreement. One approach is to work with a traditional utility to deliver the energy, and that's very similar to how energy might work in a regulated state. Another option is to work with a competitive retail supplier to deliver the energy, and many of you might already be working with a retail supplier. And the third approach is groups can actually manage their own energy by setting up a wholesale market subaccount or becoming a FERC power marketer. This is an optional and additional step to the normal PPPA. Individual buyers can pursue different methods for power delivery, but it may be easier and more cost-effective for groups to align and use the same method, but it's not required. So when working with a traditional utility, the utility will agree to deliver or sleeve the power from the project site to the buyers. This is easiest for buyers that have the same traditional utility. And for groups that are doing this, it's best to engage your utility early on, months before you intend to issue your RFP. It might take many rounds of negotiations back and forth with your traditional utility. and they may choose to issue the RFP on the group's behalf. The specific form of working with a traditional utility will depend on if your state has retail electricity choice. If you do, like Maryland, New Hampshire, and Pennsylvania, if your utility does not agree to deliver the power, you can look to working with a retail supplier, as I'll discuss on the next slide. However, if you are in a state that does not have retail choice, like Virginia, working with a traditional utility to deliver power is your only option for a physical power purchase agreement. And if your utility does not agree to deliver the power, you should look to pursuing a virtual power purchase agreement instead. Another energy delivery option is to receive the electricity through a competitive retail supplier. This works very similarly, where a retail supplier will deliver or sleeve the power from the project site to the buyers. A benefit of this is the retail supplier, similar to a utility, is taking on the managerial role of delivering the power. Your retail supplier may set up a wholesale market subaccount on behalf of the buyers and manage the power that way, but not necessarily. This option is only available to groups where buyers are in a retail choice state. This works where your group or your buyers already work with a retail supplier. You can ask them to deliver the power from a physical PPA to you at any point, or during contract negotiation with a new or existing retail supplier. The City of Chicago is a great example of a group that pursued this approach with their physical PPA. There, they asked retailers in their RFP to take on the management operations to provide the city with the physical PPA power for a fixed fee. Then the selected supplier continued to provide the city with their remaining load minus the physical PPA energy. There's no need to align for all buyers to use the same retail supplier. However, there may be benefits to doing so, and retail suppliers might like it if a group all pursues the same approach using them, because it can simplify contract negotiations, and in the case where all the buyers weren't already using the same retail supplier, might bring them additional business and give them an incentive to work with your group. A third and optional approach is to integrate these purchases into wholesale market operations via wholesale market subaccount or as a FERC energy marketer. I want to emphasize that this is an optional and additional approach to receiving your physical energy from your PPA. This is only available to cities that are in retail choice states or to those that already manage municipal utilities. A benefit of doing this is that you can actually potentially get lower electricity prices for your non-PPPA purchases. However, this is going to bring additional complexity to your group and your needs. It requires significant energy market expertise, and it also has some risk of exposure to wholesale market price volatility. So while buyers that have large electricity needs may choose to pursue this approach, or if there are entities that are already managing their wholesale market operations, may choose to continue managing their own energy associated with the physical PPA. As I mentioned, there are two ways to do this. You can either manage your wholesale power as a registered power marketer, or by working with a retailer through a dedicated subaccount. The main difference between this and the previous approach with a retail supplier is you as the buyers are taking on the main managerial duty. There are a handful of case studies of cities like Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, and Cincinnati that all took this approach, but they were already using their own subaccounts, which made it easier for them to do so. It was not an additional thing for them to do, and it was easy for them to include the physical PPA into what they were already doing. If you do decide to go the subaccount route, not all city meters or accounts would need to be incorporated. As I mentioned, not all buyers need to opt into this approach. However, it may be more cost-effective for groups to pool resources if you do choose to manage your own market operations. And so I'm just going to very quickly talk about what it entails to manage power via wholesale market subaccount. Subaccounts are a mechanism that buyers can access competitive market prices and potentially execute other wholesale energy purchases by working with an established power marketer or retailer. So as I mentioned, you would still be working with a retailer, but now the local government is taking on more of a managerial role. This is a good option for cities that already have a subaccount or have a large load and might want to make wholesale purchases. Additionally, if you're located in PJM, where many of you are, subaccounts have considerable flexibility and are a good option if you want to manage your own power delivery. The other approach is to become registered as a FERC licensed power marketer. Instead of working with a retailer, you're now going to manage your own energy in the most direct way. This is an application process with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and it really makes sense to do this if your city is already doing this, because it is a considerable additional workload than what is required to execute a physical PPA. This really is an additional step. For virtual power purchase agreements, you are not receiving the physical power, so you do not need to worry about power delivery. Instead, groups should think about the type of contract mechanism they want to do. With a traditional VPPA, buyers are going to negotiate a contract for financial settlements with a project developer via your RFP. No utility engagement or coordination with a retail supplier is needed, and the virtual power purchase agreement is not going to change your local government's normal electricity bills. Additionally, for a virtual PPA, buyers can be located anywhere in the United States. If you're pursuing a virtual power purchase agreement, you could consider pursuing a utility special contract where a traditional utility plays the role developing or contracting for the renewable facility, and the financial settlements are incorporated into the local government's utility bill. We already discussed a case study of this with Arlington County at a previous cohort meeting. And this follows the same process presented above for physical PPAs. If you'd like to work with the utility on a special contract for a virtual power purchase agreement, we recommend reaching out to your utility early on, months before your intended RFP date, and recognize that we only do have one case study of this in the country. And so it really is going to depend on a utility willing to engage with your group to develop this type of special contract. This last slide here is a summary slide that groups can reference after the fact, summarizing how engagement will vary depending on the procurement method. Who you're primarily engaging with, whether it's a utility, a retail supplier, your wholesale power market, or a developer, will depend on the type of power purchase agreement your group decides ultimately to pursue. All of these approaches do have some level of engagement that is needed with these entities. It's important to pay attention to the timing of the engagement. Specifically, if you want to work with your utility, we recommend reaching out to them early on, months before your intended RFP date. And you can time working with a retail supplier to be really whenever, but ideally when your supply contract is ending or you're already engaging with selecting a new retail supplier. And lastly, all of these approaches have different ways that they are going to be financed or paid for, just depending on the approach, whether it's sleeved onto your existing electricity bill or trued up with the developer. And so this slide here, as I said again, is just a summary slide for your reference to review. When your group knows which of these approaches you are considering, this is a good slide to check back on. And as I said, most of these approaches are best if groups engage with them with plenty of time. And while alignment is recommended, I just want to reiterate, for physical power delivery, groups do not need to fully align. However, it might be easiest to do so. And that is the end of my section. Thank you.
Yeah. So as Tacitum starts to share his screen, so Nia just presented some somewhat complex information on kind of the procurement process and how that informs stakeholder engagement. We will have time for questions on that, as well as the presentation we're just about to give at the end of this presentation. So feel free to kind of be typing questions as they come up to you in the chat. Otherwise, we can do it in real time afterwards. But for this next section, we'll be talking more about kind of like the internal stakeholder process and how that might inform your RFP. So this is really on like how are you actually going to be getting the renewable energy that you want through aggregation. And most of you will probably be releasing an RFP. For some of you, if you're working with your utility, there's a chance that your utility might be releasing it, but in general, I think we can assume that the RFP will be released within this group. So it's really important to understand kind of what your RFP requirements are. We sent out that list of some procurement process questions that we'll have time to discuss kind of in our small groups later on. But you know, it's really important to understand kind of what types of authorizations you'll need and when in the process you need to get approval from senior leadership. It's also really important to understand, are you able to participate in an RFP that you don't release? Like, can you piggyback off someone else's RFP or can you not? And that will inform kind of how you end up actually procuring your renewable resource. So what we've seen, Tatsum, if you can go to the next slide, we've kind of seen typically for an aggregated RFP, there's sort of this traditional model where the RFP is released and the partners are pretty secure by the time that RFP is released, and they say, you know, this partner wants this many megawatts, this partner wants this many megawatts. And what that does is it offers the developer a lot of security when they're responding to that RFP. They know if they give pricing for 100 megawatts, they will actually be procuring 100 megawatts. But that also requires a lot of coordination with partners up front and making sure that people feel comfortable and bought into the process before the RFP is released. We haven't really seen this model done for an aggregated offsite procurement before, but we have seen piggybacking done for community solar. And so this is kind of another model that we think could work for aggregation that offers significantly more flexibility. Essentially, one person issues an RFP and the partners may or may not be solidified at that time. And based on the RFP response, people can kind of choose to opt in or opt out to the procurement. There is, while you're offering your partners a lot of security or flexibility here, you're not offering your developers that are responding to your RFP that much security. And so there is a real risk with this piggybacking model that, you know, your developer might give you a pricing for 100 megawatts, and after your partners drop out, you know, maybe they didn't get approval before issuing the RFP. Now you're only procuring 50 megawatts, and maybe the developer no longer wants to build for you at the price that they initially gave. So there's definitely a little bit more risk when doing this piggybacking model, but it does allow more flexibility for your partners. So I'm going to pass it over to Tacitum, who's going to go through 3 different kind of real life examples of different procurements and where they fall within this process.
Thanks, Elisa, and hello, everyone. My name is Tacitum, and I'll be going over the examples that from the previous slide in great detail. To start with, I wanted to talk about the Melbourne Renewable Energy Procurement Group. As the name indicates, this project was led by the City of Melbourne in Australia. And before I go into the details, I just wanted to point out that we're having Melbourne City staff speak about their experience with this project on December 3rd at 4 p.m. Eastern. All the cohort members should have received an invite for the event on their calendars, but if you haven't, let us know, we'll send that along. It should be an event that is separate from our regular cohort meetings. So onto the process. After forming a procurement group, this Melbourne group proceeded to set up their governance structure, at which point they came up with 3 distinct decision-making bodies. The first one being the steering committee, whose role was to review risks and provide direction on strategic challenges. Second one being the project working group, which coordinated cross-partner communications. And third one being the evaluation panel, which was responsible for reviewing the proposals and recommending a finalist to the steering committee. These decisions were formalized through a memorandum of understanding with all partners, which by definition was not legally binding, but was helpful in setting the tone and the expectations about the process and each partner's responsibility along the way. The MOU also included a few other elements such as what level of sign-up was required at different milestones and protocols for cross-partner communication. The next step was to align on project eligibility and performance criteria, and those decisions were formalized via participant agreement across the organizations after the initial MOU. The group then proceeded to issue an RFP to collect proposals, select suppliers, and negotiate contracts. And I'm not going to go into much detail about those since we're focusing on the earliest stages of collaboration, but just wanted to convey that this example followed a very traditional model in that decisions about the participating entities and certain elements of the RFP and the governance structure had already been decided before getting too far into the process. And those were formalized through different two separate documents. Second example that I wanted to highlight is the New York Higher Education Consortium, which was formed by 5 public and private universities in the state of New York. They followed a very similar process as Melbourne's, but a few differences worth highlighting are that there was a range of megawatt hours that the group was interested, listed in the RFP as being interested in. So they set a minimum based on, what could be financially viable for a VPPA in terms of minimum scale, and then a maximum being the aggregate amount of everybody's maximum interest. Because of that, the level of commitment was much less formalized at this stage than with Melbourne. So just allowing for more flexibility, but at the same time also causing allowing for less security for the developers, since they have to, there's a range that they can respond to. Another thing worth highlighting is that the participants could either accept the full amount that they originally indicated, accept part of it, or drop off. So it was more flexible in that regard as well. The last example I wanted to highlight is the Metropolitan Council Community Solar Garden Collaborative, which was, as Elisa mentioned, community solar, but has some key elements that are transferable to what we were talking about in this cohort. They used a piggybacking model through which that allowed them a greater level of flexibility, even more than the New York example. So in terms of the process, they follow the same pattern of setting up a steering and evaluation committee, deciding on the anchor off-taker. And then the anchor off-taker hosted a kickoff meeting with all potential interested entities. So there were 44 local governments in attendance, and they basically came in to learn about what the group had in mind and what this project would look like. However, a key difference here is that the anchor off-taker did not ask the interested entities to formalize their expression of interest before issuing the RFP. So the anchor off-taker proceeded to issue the document and only asked that the other entities formalize their interest through letters of intent, which were to be issued after the initial release of the RFP, but a few weeks before the proposals for RFP responses were due. Then the anchor issued an RFP addendum just listing those additional members in the RFP. Just like with New York, the participants, once the bids were in, participants were allowed to either accept full or in part, or decline the offers. So this, basically taking a step back, goes a step further in terms of flexibility by allowing flexibility not only in terms of the amount of megawatt hours to be procured and the members to participate, but also the timing. The first two examples had a set group before RFP release, whereas in this case, that was only decided afterwards. A key lesson learned in this example is that the process almost allowed for too much flexibility, where anyone could drop out at any time. So for this reason, they did not get competitive pricing as a benefit of aggregation. So to allow for piggybacking while maintaining competitive pricing, we actually suggest asking developers to share how pricing would change at different thresholds. So for example, 20 megawatts as compared to 50 megawatts. This makes life easier for developers so they can map their proposals to a few different scenarios, and also makes it easier to make the case for the financial benefit of aggregation to the participants. Last slide here, I just wanted to, as a summary of some key differences here and how they map each example to this traditional to piggybacking model range. So key things to highlight is the first two examples had a member list finalized before issuing the RFPs, whereas the third example did so after the RFP. Members' level of commitment was formalized very early on from Melbourne before the RFP, whereas the other two did so during the evaluation stage. The amount of purchase was set for Melbourne, whereas in the case of New York and Metropolitan Council, they were flexible. And in the first case, members were all accepted to accept the full amount that they were offered, whereas in the other two cases, they could accept anywhere between none and the full amount that they had originally stated. So with that, I revert back to Elisa. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Tatsutome. So at this point, I'm going to open it up for some Q&A. I saw one question come in from Pam. So Pam, I don't know, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, I was just, for the physical PPA and doing the traditional method where you talk to your utility, can we go outside? Like, we currently have West Penn Power, which is a First Energy company, and they have more in Pennsylvania, but could we go with Duquesne Light? Like, can you cross utilities? I mean, or go across the state or even go outside of the state? It seems, I thought physical meant you sort of had to be closer to each other.
Yeah, so you would need to work with your utility. You wouldn't be able to have partners that are outside their utility unless it's in a retail choice state, where you could then go with a retail supplier that is outside of your utility. But if you're working with your traditional utility, everyone would have to be a member of that traditional utility.
Okay, so that sort of helps us define. Right now, we're looking at all within our own utility, but if we were going to go outside of that, we would want to look at retail supplier. Is Pennsylvania a retail choice state? I think it is.
It is, yep.
Okay.
So if you wanted to go with a retail choice supplier, you would essentially need to, there is more flexibility there. I think retail choice suppliers, because it's more competitive, would be probably more willing to sleeve a deal for you. Whereas, because they like want your business, whereas the utility, I've found that they might be willing, but they have a little bit more ability to just say no, because to some degree they,
They're out.
Yeah, they're not quite as competitive as the retail suppliers.
Can I ask one more question on that?
Yeah, go ahead.
With retail choice, and you might have said it, but it's all sort of making more sense now. If we, are we going to have to bid out with the developer for the virtual PPA and a separate one with the retailer, or can we tie those together, or we can do both, or either?
Yeah, so if you're doing a virtual power purchase agreement, you don't need to work with a retail supplier or your utility, because you're not physically transferring the power. So that can be just a totally separate agreement that you work out with your developer. If you're doing physical, we've seen this done two different ways with retail suppliers. If you currently have a retail supplier, you could ask them to sleeve it for you, and see if they're open to that. Alternatively, let's say your retail supply contract is up in 2 years. You could say, hey, for our new retail supply contract, we want a physical power purchase agreement to be part of that. And so it could, in theory, be an RFP that includes both kind of the ask for the physical PPA and the new supply contract. So it could be done either way. And we've seen that done either way.
Right. And so then, since there's multiple one of us involved, we could have different retail suppliers. And so the question is, yes, it probably makes sense to all come together, but it's not a requirement, right? You know, it's sort of, we have to figure that out. And can you just define what sleeving is, so I make sure I understand it?
Yeah, that's essentially just delivering the physical power. So if you sleeve it, you're delivering the physical power.
So it's something that they take care of, and it's just a term that means it physically is coming from that solar panel to our location.
Correct. Yeah.
Locations. Okay. Thank you.
So Carol just asked the same question, so I'm good that we're answering what sleeving is. Let's see. I'm not seeing any other questions, but if someone else has a question, feel free to unmute yourself and ask. Okay, well, there might not be any more. Great. So I think then what we'll do at this point is you out into your small groups, and in these small group conversations, we're going to give you 20 minutes to talk a little bit about, we sent you a list of procurement questions. I'm not sure if everyone's had a chance to talk to their procurement team, but this is kind of a time to start going through those procurement questions and get some ideas on, you know, start thinking about what you might want that RFP to look like and who is releasing it and what that process might be. So Matthew should be sending you into small breakout groups now.
Okay, so yeah, as Elisa mentioned, I'm going to be talking about risks and risk mitigation strategies. But before that, just wanted to take a step back and note that any strategy to purchase electricity or renewable attributes will come with a mixture of benefits, costs, and risks. So it's not just offsite deals that are inherently have risks. Even just continuing to purchase energy on the wholesale market, if that's how you're currently purchasing energy, has risks there, as well as potentially just the benefits of focusing on other priorities, but from a climate perspective, not many benefits there. But from costs, you have your business as usual costs, and then for the risks, short and long-term price volatility, just inherently and continuing to operate on the business as usual, and potential future increases in prices. So just operating business as usual has a mixture of benefits, costs, and risks. There's obviously the option to just purchase unbundled RECs, and while that's a little bit easier, it's always going to have a cost premium, and there are short and long-term REC price volatility there, as well as the climate risk of not really having as much of an impact on adding renewables to the grid. Quickly on site PPAs, there's some benefits if they're a little more straightforward, still having the hedge value, local benefits, could be saving or losing money depending on future electricity rates, and some minimal risks there with financial uncertainty. But what we're here for today are offsite PPAs. I think you all by now have a good sense of the benefits of scale and geographic flexibility, potential cost savings, hedge value, things like that. Whether they save or lose money depends on future prices. But the risks really, there's a couple of various risks that I'll get into in a second here, leading to financial uncertainty. So that's the area, that's the topic area that I'll focus in today. But just to note that they're not the only strategy that have risks that are inherent to them. So understanding these risks is an important first step in order to adequately mitigate them. So I'll go through a list here. The first one is price risk. So this is the uncertainty regarding the movement and volatility of wholesale electricity prices. And this would impact the city's PPA deal if the market prices are above the PPA price. Cities with PPAs can benefit by paying below market rates. And then if the market prices fall below the PPA price, cities with VPPAs will pay a premium, and physical deals will have a higher price than just in business as usual. There's basis risk. So this is the uncertainty regarding the change between the renewable generator's market price at that location and the city's load zone price, so the price that the city is paying. And basis risk can reduce a city's ability to use PPAs as a hedge against future electricity price changes if there's that uncertainty between those two prices. Non-energy market risk is obviously non-energy market changes, but uncertainty regarding what happens after the PPA is signed outside of just the energy market. So things like how REC prices could impact the deal, the capacity market, things like that. And those can all impact the future financial result of the deal. Shape risk is the specific timing of renewable generation and how that intersects with the prices at that time. So uncertainty, this could create uncertainty in revenues that the city receives in a VPPA, depending on when the renewable generator is performing and producing energy and what the prices are, and then the deal's opportunity cost in a physical PPA. Additionally, in a physical deal, this impacts the amount of energy to purchase or sell, to manage over or under production. Operational risk is specifically the performance of the generators due to failed processes or external events. So this could lead to decreased generation, which, depending on the timing of the generation that's lost, could result in decreased profit or loss. And lastly, last of the risks that I'll note here is volume risk. So this is the actual overall amount of generation created, specifically due to weather conditions. And again, this could impact the overall financial impact of the deal. And out of these 6, you might be wondering what's most important. And typically, those are in order of importance to the buyer. So price risk and basis risk and non-energy market risk having potentially the biggest impact on the hedge value and the financial impact of the deal. Go into some of the risk mitigation strategies to mitigate these risks. So the first one being a common strategy of price floors and or collars. So these are agreements within a VPPA contract between the city and project owner to reduce the city's exposure to prices below a certain threshold for a price floor and below and above a certain threshold for a price collar. Quickly clear those. So for an example here, there is, this is just an example of, let's say the city signs a PPPA price of $30 per megawatt hour, but over time, it turns out that the market price fluctuates, but kind of goes down over time, leading to a cost premium for this deal and a loss. And what a price floor would do is to, let's say that there was a $25 per megawatt hour price floor, which in that case would mitigate all of these avoided costs here. So if there was a $25 per megawatt hour price floor, none of the wholesale prices that fall below that floor would be impacted in the deal. So you would just be paying 25 instead of that lower value. So you'd have that avoided cost going forward. So that's one way to mitigate potential future prices dropping below a certain threshold. Another strategy here is called hub settlement, and this can be done in virtual and physical deals to mitigate basis risk. So in a VPPA, the city would settle at the hub to receive the generator's hub pricing instead of the node pricing as its floating market price. So the node is the generator's interconnection point price. So it's 1 point price, and the hub is the simple average of all the nodes within its hub region. For a physical deal, the city chooses to take delivery at their load zone. So the load zone is similar to a hub. It's just the load weighted average of node prices within that load zone. So I'm going to give an example of what this would look like. So again, basis risk is that difference between the change in prices at the renewable generator's location at that node or hub and the change in price in the city's load zone. So let's say that you're in PJM Dominion and this is supposed to represent the circles being the nodes and the multiple circles being the load zone here or the hub. So if you're in PJM Dominion, let's say that these are some wholesale prices that you experience over the course of a year, monthly average prices. And in order to hedge against that fluctuation, you sign a deal in West Texas, in ERCOT West. So you sign a wind deal that's interconnected into node 1 here. And those prices somewhat follow that line. So you're hedging against that in most months, but say in April, September, and October, they don't follow as much. So there's that basis risk. And one thing that you could do instead of receiving just the nodes prices is you could receive in the solid line here, the hub prices, which are less volatile. So while it doesn't as much solve for the issue in April, it does solve for some of the basis risk and increase the hedge value in September and October. So that's, and the last thing actually I'll note is just to quickly note all the other prices, and these are actually real prices in ERCOT West of the other nodes. And while there's a lot of fluctuation in the specific node prices, the actual hub price is a little bit smoother because it's the average and less volatile. Okay, into the next mitigation strategy here is good faith renegotiation. So these clauses are a standard strategy included in most contracts to mitigate price and non-energy market risk. So in either virtual or physical deals, these are clauses that state if an impactful regulatory change occurs, the city and project owner must meet and attempt in good faith to renegotiate so that they're try to restore both of their parties to the original balance of burdens and benefits. So in the energy market changes, these could be things like changes to ISO policies or pricing methodologies that inherently change the balance of burdens and benefits there. These could be capacity market changes. So for example, in PJM, the minimum offer price rule is an example of what that would trigger this because it was an actual regulatory change to the capacity market. This could also apply to REC market changes depending on how the structure treats the REC revenues there. So for a quick example of what this could look like, these are some REC prices in a few states over the last decade. And one example of what could be an example of triggering this good faith renegotiation clause is in Ohio, they passed a bill called Senate Bill 310 in 2014 that really impacted the future value of REC prices in the state. So that could be an example of something that would trigger this to renegotiate. And the last thing I'll note on this is one aspect that is sometimes included in a good faith renegotiation clause is a backstop clause. So I believe the city of Philadelphia may have included one in their recent PPA that if the parties aren't able to actually come to an agreement, there's a backstop increase or decrease in price that correlates to whatever that was. So for example, if an RPS change impacts REC prices by at least increases them by at least 75% and the parties can't agree to an amendment, then the PPA rate will, depending on who's receiving those revenues, change by $2 per megawatt hour or something like that. So a backstop clauses could be there in case parties are not able to agree on a future thing. Okay, so then getting to mitigating operational risk here, production guarantees mostly in physical deals and proxy generation in virtual deals are common to mitigate operational risk. So production guarantees are very common in standards in physical deals that say when the developer will commence production, how much will be produced, and when the generation will be available. Proxy gen is specifically in virtual deals that states based on the actual weather resource that's produced, it calculates what the hourly volume of energy should be had it achieved its full operational efficiency. So this mitigates things like force majeure events. So an example is an unforeseen event like a natural disaster that causes disruption to the generator. This could be unplanned downtime, like a substation fails, or the generator has maintenance that's unplanned for, or the system is curtailed. So if this is an example would be limited generation due to more wind being actually produced than the grid demands, so some systems being curtailed. And these strategies here can mitigate against some of those unplanned risks that could come up, specifically for operational risks. Okay, and the last strategy that I'll actually dive into here is retailer firm generation. So again, this is, Mia touched on this, this is for those in retail choice states, but it can eliminate or reduce shape, volume, basis, and operational risk. So a contract that's signed through a retail provider that incorporates renewable generation into the city's retail service. And they're going to manage all the over and under production from the assets and really mitigate a lot of these risks that are inherent here. So an example is the city of Houston recently, for all of their municipal load signed a deal that would get them to 100% renewable energy through their retail supplier Energy. So this was a solar facility that the retail provider secured, and then through a 5-year contract with 2 1-year renewals, enabled the city to achieve 100% renewable energy for their municipal operations, actually just through their retailer. And the retailer was taking on those risks of over and under production, shape risk, volume risk, and all of that. Okay, so the last slide that I'll note here on the actual strategies are just some emerging solutions that I won't dive into, but that we do include in our paper that is about to be released on some emerging strategies to reduce or eliminate a lot of these risks. So one is a settlement guarantee agreement, or an SGA. And this is a financial add-on to VPPAs, typically after the contract is signed, to transfer price, shape, and volume risk to an insurer. There's something called a fixed volume price swap, another financial add-on between the city and a hedge provider, specifically to mitigate price risk. And then a VFA, or volume firming agreement, another financial add-on in addition to the contract to eliminate shape and volume risk. So I'm not gonna dive into too much of these today, since we don't have enough time to really get into the nuance there. But again, our paper does provide a lot of more detail on these 3 emerging solutions. So this is just a table that I've summarized all of those risk mitigation strategies, which contract type they prefer to, and their risk that they mitigate. And this table is also in our paper, straight from it, but just summarizes that there's a lot of risks that are out there, but there's also a lot of strategies that are there to mitigate these risks. And some are a lot more common or standard than others, like hub settlement being almost standard today, good faith renegotiation, production guarantees being very standard, floors and collars and proxy generation being common, but maybe not as standard as others. And then those emerging solutions below. We have time. I'll give a time check for Elisa for some Q&A. Elisa, do we have time for some Q&A?
We do have time. Yep, we still have 10 minutes for Q&A. I'm seeing we had a few questions come in. So why don't I start with Pam? You asked a good question on price floors. Can you unmute and ask?
Yep, and I think now that I've seen the other things not checked, that price floors are only for virtual PPAs. They are not for physical PPAs, correct?
Yes, that is, yeah, I'm giving a quick double check for myself. But yeah, they're specifically in virtual deals for the market price that the city would be paying to the developer. So it's the specifically just in virtual deals.
I was going to ask Ryan, so if a physical power purchase agreement was, if it was set up like a sub account where it had the wholesale market pricing coming in, like if the physical power was subject to wholesale market pricing, could you set up a floor or collar for it? Is it really the only reason that floor and collar is VPPAs because typically physical isn't subject to wholesale market pricing?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm less familiar with how, I guess, the sub accounts really work, but given what was presented today and what you noted, Lisa, I could see that being possible, but yeah, also interested if Steve has heard of any examples of that in the past. I am not familiar with any.
I haven't. Again, just to stress, I think the floor in these cases would be controlling the revenue that's generated by selling the power into the wholesale market. So if you have a floor of 25, as Ryan showed, and the price drops to $22, the city would still be receiving that $25. In a physical PPA, you're generally just getting the actual electricity, so there's not that same wholesale market exposure. I suppose if you were in a situation where the city was responsible for selling electricity that was in excess of what it needed in a given hour, if you were in that situation, you could conceive of a floor, but that would be a bit of an edge case.
So a question came in from Carol. Carol, do you want it was sort of a question, sort of a statement, but I'm curious if you have kind of a follow-up there.
Yeah, so I guess I'm a little bit struggling right now because I feel like I appreciate that you want us to all kind of understand the level of complexity and all the different elements, but I feel like as local government staff, our ability to either master this content realistically and negotiate effectively is low. And all of these elements are really better suited to us hiring an outside consultant. And I don't know if others are feeling the same way, but sort of the level of specificity here is like, it's really truly beyond me personally. I'll just out myself as not having the brain capacity for it or the base knowledge. But I also feel like this is the different listing out all the different levels of risk is going to cause my higher decision makers to run screaming. I feel like it's far better to lay out, here are the elements, and you are best served by hiring somebody to advocate these on your behalf.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a good thing to flag, because it's a very complex topic. And I think if you look at aggregated procurements that have been done in the past, they do have, they tend to have technical assistance support from outside entities because it is pretty complex. And so I think that the hope of this cohort is to make you aware of the complexities, because, for instance, if you're pitching this to your senior leadership and they say, well, we're really concerned that we don't know what we don't know whether we're making money or losing money, and how do we deal with that? Being able to know, there are risk mitigation strategies and we're having a consultant look into that. I think that's maybe the level that should be taken away. And so thinking about I think we're throwing a lot at you, and probably 20% of it needs to fully be digested. If that's helpful.
That's good to hear. And I saw that Peter wanted to follow up, and maybe also Joe on my question / diatribe.
Yeah, Peter, do you want to go?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that for our group, where we have really varying levels of experience with these things, we do have someone in our group who works at a renewable energy company, for example. And so we're really fortunate in that regard. I also worked on the Penn State solar power project. So I've gotten in here, but we have this incredible range of understanding in our group. And so our thought was, by learning here in a really structured way, we would be better suited as a group to know what to look for as we work with a services consultant, so that we can have increased accountability from our core working group, knowing that we're running between the elected officials and the eventual PPA. So it is so complicated. And I appreciate, Alyssa, that you said 20%, because I think that's probably good enough. And then Joe, who's in our cohort, my group, has something to say too.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up with what Peter said on there. Where we are is we're not necessarily to the point of saying, yes, we're going forth with a PPA at this point. I mean, that is a decision that we need more information for, but we think it's worth investigating. So taking it step by step, if you look at the final goal of saying, okay, this is where we are now, and we're going to set up a PPA and we're going 100% full board in there, it's not going to work. You got to take it step by step. So, where we've taken the mindset is we come to a stopping point, we ask the questions, we get those answered, and we keep moving forward. And that's one of the reasons why we're putting out an RFP for consulting services, so to help identify some questions we may not know, but hopefully with the background that Peter provides and somebody else who's an energy services consultant and the consultant as well who we're hiring, we can get all those questions answered, and we can sort of take this step by step rather than looking at the whole road that's in front of us. You know, you don't run a marathon, you know, and think, oh God, it's 26 miles. You take it a step at a time.
Yeah, thanks, Peter and Joe. I think that's good flavor to add. I'm seeing, Peter, you also had a question for Ryan on congestion.
Yeah, and maybe I'm kind of barking up a wrong tree here, but as electricity, generation starts getting added and subtracted from the grid over time, we could end up with, we're going to end up with new places where congestion ends up being an issue. Has that ever been cause for opening up the good faith clause or some other clause? I'm just trying to think about how that risk might be dealt with.
Yeah, I don't know of any examples of that triggering that type of clause. I feel like if it was a virtual deal, more like proxy generation would probably address that. I think typically the good faith renegotiation clause is about a regulatory change that results in something that is now different than what it was before the contract was signed. But I guess it could also depend on how it's there for structural changes. So if there's so much congestion that it's a huge deal, then it kind of depends on the wording in the contract, I would say there. But I would say not something that I've seen that is common to trigger that clause.
Thank you.
And I see one, this will be the final question, then we'll wrap up. I see a question from Charles. So Charles, do you want to unmute and ask that question?
Okay. Hey, yeah, didn't want to take much time. I did send a message to Mav. So I think most of the jurisdiction here are part of VPPA. We get these electricity and natural and gas prices with them. And now that we're in these VPPA deal that we had, I was trying to get some information about, do we even worry about hedging on the price of energy going forward, since we still will be honoring VPPA contract, for example?
I might not be as familiar with the VPPA contract understanding to answer this, or maybe I'm not understanding the question right.
This is Susan Hafley. I chair VPPA, and I'd like to just say that, first of all, the VPPA contract only pertains to electricity in the Dominion territory, and it doesn't really have an impact on power purchase agreements, whether they are virtual or physical. So I'm happy to follow up with anybody offline, but the VPPA contract simply says, with respect to physical PPAs, that we'll follow the state statutory provisions and regulations. It doesn't address virtual, and that's because it's not a procurement of electricity.
Okay.
Great. Thanks, Susan. Good to have an expert on the call on that, because I also was not.
Very limited.
All right, so Ryan, if you could share just kind of the wrap up slide. So thank you all for attending our third aggregation meeting. Our next steps for this are, we do have another aggregation meeting December 15th. For that meeting, we're going to be talking about pitching to senior leadership. Kind of pitching this concept, how do you even talk about this very complex topic with senior leadership? And we'll have, Yuning will go through a pitch deck that she's been developing, and we'll also have a couple guest speakers, one from delivery associates who their role is essentially like, how do you bring an idea from an idea to completion? And then also Ideas 42, who is, they're kind of behavioral specialists. And so they're really good at thinking about, how do you get, like, what information do you actually need to share, and how do you present things in a way that kind of gets you to a yes. The next thing I want to highlight is something Tatsito mentioned. There is going to be another meeting that is specifically on the Melbourne example. So Melbourne has agreed to kind of host a meeting where they're going to give a quick overview of kind of their procurement deal. And then there will be a bunch of time for Q&A. So that's open to this cohort group as well as a bunch of other C40 cities. So it's not, you know, officially within this cohort group, but I would highly recommend attending just because it's probably one of the only examples that I've seen of a city-led aggregation group to date. So I think you can learn a lot from this procurement group. The other thing I mentioned is that there is a risk mitigation primer that's about 40 pages. Is it 40? Maybe it's only 20 pages. It's pretty long. And it goes through kind of each of the risk mitigation strategies in a lot more detail. So if you were listening and it was hard to digest it the first time, I would highly recommend looking through that risk mitigation primer because that does kind of walk you through it a little bit more slowly and in more detail. And then finally, just a reminder that today's presentation is recorded and that will be available on our website. And the slides for this presentation will also be on our website as well as the risk mitigation primer. So we'll send out an email just reminding you about that, but everything should be available there. So thank you all for your time today. I know this was a complex presentation. I think there have been a few complex presentations back to back. So thank you for taking the time to kind of try to digest that. And I hope everyone has a very good Thanksgiving break. So I'm going to be on the line for about 10 more minutes in case there are any other questions, but at this point, everyone can feel free to hop off if you don't have any active questions.